Hello, everybody. Welcome to World History. Today I'm going to be talking about the elements in French society that really led to the French Revolution, especially their class system. So, this is all background information for understanding the French Revolution, which is our new unit that we're really going to be going in depth about. So, this is a kind of long and complicated story, so we need to set some background, we need to set up the background of this entire story. So the background behind the story, though, is the French class system. So we're going to go over what that all entailed, because they had what was known as the estate system. So we're going to be talking about the first estate, second estate, and third estate, and why each one of those was important, and what they actually contributed to what happens in the French Revolutions. This is all the background. So what was the First Estate? The First Estate really consisted of the Roman Catholic Church. This was less than 1% of the population, and they paid no taxes. They actually owned 1/10 of all the land, or 10%. It's the same thing. I do some math teaching on the side. 10%, 1/10. Yeah, that's the same thing. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure I was on the ball there. So they owned 1/10 of all the land, and that was due to tithing. Tithing existed for every person who was under the church at the time, which was basically everybody. So the fact that people had to not just give up 10% of their income, but also 10% of what they owned, including their land. So the church actually had this enormous amount of real estate, and they could charge people to live there. So the church was very wealthy because of this. Most of the people who were in the First Estate had become wealthy, worldly, and kind of neglectful of their spiritual duties at this time, just because it was definitely a nice life to have if you're in the church. Today we think of religious people kind of taking, somewhat of a vow of not being as, worldly or as, rich or wealthy, but it was not really the case during this time. The Second Estate. Who was the Second Estate? Basically, this is the nobility. So these are the people who get to wear fancy hats and wear swords around. So when we think of an aristocrat, of someone very wealthy, this is who we're talking about. The nobility. These are the people who have a title like a count or a duchess or something like that. This is who we're talking about. It's represented less than 2% of the population, and you had to be born into it. It was prestige and wealth that just came from who your parents were. They paid few taxes, if any. The only kind of taxes they would pay would be the things that they would give to the church, but that was it. They didn't have to actually give any money to the king, to the crown. Because remember, at this time, France is ruled by one king. It's an absolute monarchy. So, and the way that the king stays in power is that he gets the taxes and then funds the army and keeps everybody safe. Or at least that's the way it's supposed to work. The nobility is the one who owns most of the land, and they collect feudal dues from peasants. They held positions in the army and the government. As a class, they were extravagant. Basically, these are the people who, there's the have and the have-nots, and the haves, or the people at the top, had a lot of stuff. So the people with the large estates, who wear, the really fancy clothes and eat the fancy food. So this is the nobility. That's the Second Estate. And then everybody else, the Third Estate. 97% of France's population. They were divided into three groups. So we have the Third Estate, and the Third Estate is further split up into three. We have what is known as the bourgeoisie. You can read that word because remember, we are talking about French words here, so the pronunciation might not look the same as the way we read it. So when you see this word, remember it's bourgeoisie, or I might just say the bourgeois. And of course, this is where the popular term in rap music now, bougie, comes from this word, bourgeoisie. So basically, this was the people who lived in the cities, who were still part of the Third Estate, who didn't have a fancy title because of how they were born, but because they actually really helped the economy be what it is. The bourgeoisie live in the cities, and they're made up of merchants, manufacturers, and professional people, such as doctors and lawyers. So the bourgeoisie are interesting because they have a lot of power just because of who they are in society, but they have almost no power or say in the government because they haven't been born into the noble class. So we have this interesting divide where there's these people who are very successful, but they don't have any political power. That's the bourgeoisie. And that's part of the third estate. But then we have also the laborers and artisans, people who make things like furniture and manufactured goods. And then finally we have peasants, which is most people. And those are the people basically contracted to farm, who basically have to give a lot of the money that they end up making just to live on the land that's owned by the nobility. That's the third estate, and that's the vast, vast majority of people, 97%. They also paid 10% of their money to the church. So these are the people who actually have to pay taxes. The interesting thing is that the people who had the most money actually didn't have to pay taxes. Imagine that. Growing discontent. There's a growing population in France. Technology is getting better and people are living longer. There's less infant mortality. It's of course a much bigger issue than it is today at this point, but it's getting better. So that just means that more children are surviving childhood and living to adulthood. So there's a growing population, parents are having more children, more mouths to feed. The upper estates force more taxes, dues, and rents on the third estate. So basically they keep taxing and they keep grabbing as much money as they can from the third estate. They even charge them to pick up sticks to make, to make a fire. So basically, imagine going camping, and you find a fallen down tree somewhere, and then you chop off the wood, and then you make a fire with that. You would be charged for doing something like that. Food prices were going up faster than wages. So what's happening is that the price of food is going up, and people just don't have the wages, and they don't have enough money to actually pay for it. And why is the price of food rising? Well, we'll talk about that. But here are the results of the problems. Lots of riots and violence. A lot of people actually turn to banditry or becoming brigands, going out and trying to raid the countryside or raid people's houses. They turn to a life of crime to basically just to survive. A lot of people start wishing for freedom. And, the idea of freedom and liberty becomes a more and more important ideal, especially as the Enlightenment is really going into high gear at this time. And what's funny is that the different interpretations of the word freedom that are going around. The first two estates think that freedom means freedom from taxation, which is an interesting way of thinking of it. For most people in the third estate especially, freedom meant freedom from want. So freedom from fear of starving. The bourgeoisie had the most complaints of all, and they'll become very important to the story of the French Revolution. They're really the people who are going to gain the most from the revolution and gain the most power. But before that time, at this point here, where the problems of France are getting more and more acute, the bourgeois are complaining that they want political power equal to their economic strength. They are resenting paying as much taxes as they do, especially because the nobility doesn't have to pay taxes almost at all. And they want positions in the army, church, and the government. And just because of where they were born, not so much what they've earned, they were not allowed to have positions in those three places. The financial crisis. So the crisis is getting even worse. So what made it so people couldn't afford things like bread and basic food? Well, what happened is that French money was becoming less and less valuable, and there was less of it to go around. So what caused it? So Louis XV, who was the king of France at this point, Louis XVI, his son, will become a very important person in our story. So Louis XV borrowed too much money, and he basically did this for his long rule of France. And he basically set his son, the 16th, up with the bills, that you'll take care of it. Well, then when Louis XVI became king, he wasn't exactly sure how he was going to pay this off. They also spent a lot of money to assist the American Revolution, and that happened after 1776. So America was going through their revolution, as we'll learn about in your junior year, and France was enormously helpful into making sure that was successful. And the reason the French joined on the American side was to fight back at their rival, the British. So the Americans win, and that's great, but however, France is left with this large bill, and they don't really have a way to pay for it. So there's just this economic crisis is really becoming more and more of an issue just on a basic level of how you gonna the government is broke, people are broke, everyone's broke. What did Louis XVI decide it was necessary to do? Well, he's going to take the step of taxing the first and second estates for the first time ever. It's like, hey, you guys need to pay in. We need our country to survive this. Well, they were not very happy about this idea at all. And they said, forget it. We want our freedom from being taxed. Like 97% of people were, but don't worry about that for now. So basically, he decided, okay, the problems of the country are too big for me to just solve on my own, even though I am an absolute monarch. Let's have a meeting of the Estates General. And that's where you bring all the three estates together for a big conference. And this hadn't been called in over 150 years. So basically he's saying we're going to all get everybody in France together, all the major people in the first estate, the second estate, and representatives from the third estate. We're going to join together and figure out how to solve this crisis. And this is going to set up the next big part of our story. So hopefully you can join me then, and I will see you guys later.